All right, now I know what. All right, chapter 11. Now the chapter begins with Jackson. The vignette is about Jackson. Grew up poor. He was born in a log cabin. We've had several presidents who grew up in poverty. Among them Lincoln, Jackson, Fillmore. And some of them grew up as commoners. Some of them men like Grant. But anyway, Jackson grew up in poverty, orphaned at the age of 14. He was an Indian fighter. He achieved lasting fame after winning at New Orleans. He appeared to be a self-made man. He said a man doesn't have to be born to the at the top to get to the top. A man can be born low and get to the top. All right, so much for the vignette in opening up chapter 11. Now, transportation. Transportation began to get better as time went on, and eventually, about this time, a man named Robert Fulton invented the steam engine. Now, Robert Fulton, pardon me, let me correct that. No, he didn't. Robert Fulton invented the steamship. The steam engine had been invented in the early 1600s over in the Old World. Fulton, the steamboat, or steamship. Now, on a personal note, I mean, I've got documented where my ancestors used to start at Pittsburgh. I mean, I told you that some of them are Western Pennsylvanians. And they'd float down the Ohio River and float down to the Mississippi River and go all the way to New Orleans. But they couldn't float back, and they couldn't row back either. And a sail wouldn't help them. Sailboats do not work well going upstream against the river, so they have to walk back. It was certainly a long walk. It was easy to get down, hard to get back. But anyway, the steamboat changed all that. The steamboat meant that boats could go upriver, could go upstream. The steamboat became popular, but the one problem with steamboats was the boiler tended to explode. They did not know what we know about metallurgy. Now, I can tell you at Lockheed, I worked there, and we had to deal with metal. Mankind eventually learned how to make a piece of metal to have the same strength, they're called uniform strength throughout the metal. But in those days, using a blacksmith's hammer, metal did not have uniform strength. And if a piece of metal had a weakness, particularly a boiler, a steam boiler would blow up. And a lot of steam boilers blew up, and killed people. I believe if you wanted to be on a steamboat, they stay away from the boiler as much as possible because it can kill you. It could kill you. Anyway, nevertheless, a lot of people used the steamboats. They were dangerous, but people would use them. They were unpredictable. Now, they dug a lot of canals. The most famous canal was the Erie Canal, which joined Buffalo to Albany, or Albany to Buffalo. Now, some students wonder, what's important about that? Simply this: it meant that a ship could start in New York City, go up the Hudson River to Buffalo, and take the canal from Buffalo, go up the Hudson River to Albany. My bad, I'm sorry, maybe I'm getting old. Up the Hudson River to Albany, and then go from Albany up across the Erie Canal to Buffalo, and once at Buffalo, he'd be on Lake Erie. That's why it's called the Erie Canal. And then once at Lake Erie, he could go all over the Great Lakes, and a lot of our bigger cities, including Chicago, Toledo, Erie, Pennsylvania, Cleveland, Ohio, Detroit, Michigan, Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, big cities we have located on the shores of the Great Lakes, got to be big owing to traffic trade. Now, the advantage a canal had was a horse. It didn't take a good horse, even an old horse who might have been over the hill horse, not a lame horse particularly. They had to know those that shoot those or make glue out of them. But a horse could pull one horse could pull tons of barges on a canal. Sometimes you two horses, one on one side of the canal, one on the other, these two horses. And again, they didn't even have to be strong. Then these horses would trot along. The same two horses could not have pulled a wagon weighing that much. It would have taken maybe 20 or 30 horses to pull the wagon. But one horse, two horses could pull a barge that weighed several tons. The Erie Canal was no more than maybe 4 or 5 feet deep, but they could still carry a whole lot of weight with a flat bottom barge.
So the canal is basically water, or is
Water, it was water. Oh yeah, the canal was water. Water. The problem though with water in the wintertime.
Walk through the water.
Hey, what?
The horse.
The horse would walk on the side. The horse would walk on the side. And they'd have a man there to keep the barge from hitting the banks of the canal. So in other words, the horse they had to have a man walking along, but the horse did most of the pulling. Because a horse, even an older horse, could pull much more than a man could. So they'd have a man there to keep the barge from hitting the side of the canal. Or if it did, it wouldn't hit very hard. But the problem with canals, though, they froze up in wintertime. And I will admit, the winters back then might have been colder than they are now. We were coming off an ice age, and some people believe we still are. Anyway, now, eventually, the railroad was to make the canal obsolete. But in the 1830s, canal building stopped because of rails. The trains could go in cold weather or warm. Anyway, now of course trains would be stopped by a 4 or 5 foot snow bank or snow drift. Even those, the train could not ride, but that didn't happen often. But in cold weather, even when the ice was frozen over on the rivers and canals, and if you know anything about water freezing, flowing water does not easily freeze. But the water in a canal, which was not flowing, would freeze every time the temperature dropped low enough. But a river will keep flowing. But even in sub-freezing or sub-zero temperatures. All right. Factories started. The earliest factories were clothing factories. And it was learned that a factory with the machinery could make a better product. For instance, the spinning wheel might turn out yarn that was not really uniform strength, uniform thickness, thicker in places and thinner in others. And now you've seen the spinning wheel, might know what I mean. The spinning wheel would spin out yarn, but the factories eventually learned how to make yarn and make thread that was of uniform strength throughout. Then they learned how to weave with a power weaver. That's what machinery. The word factory connotes machines and workers. At first, the workers were mostly women and mostly low paid. And the women would go on strike, and the factory workers factory owners would simply hire other workers to replace the striking workers and fire the strikers. Now, folk, on a personal note, my Aunt Rosie, who's still alive, worked at a sewing factory in Jamestown, Kentucky before it went out of business. And she tried to form a union one day, and she got fired and remained fired for the rest of her life from the sewing factory. Again, this is the way that business was run here in the South a lot of the time. All right. At Lockheed, yes, we did have a union. Women began working, and a lot of times even married women would work. And this was the beginning of married women working outside the home to supplement a family's income. It wasn't popular at the time, but it was done. Banks would issue their own currency, their own paper money, and a lot of counterfeiting went on. No, counterfeiting is not a thing of the past. Just like about 2 weeks ago, a young student paid for his lunch not knowing that the $20 bill he handed over was counterfeit. He got caught, and they were going to suspend him, but then they realized he had no knowledge that it was counterfeit. and he couldn't even tell how he came about the money. I guess his father had given it to him, whatever. Anyway, they took the suspension away because they felt like the young man was innocent. But counterfeiting still goes on. But counterfeiting was easier in those days than it is today because they didn't have the elaborate system of disguising real money to make sure it was difficult to counterfeit. All right, takes us up to our first economic downturn. Except for the time of Jefferson had the embargo on, the American economy from the time of the ratification of the Constitution mostly went up. But then came 1819, and the economy experienced a downturn. This was called the Panic of 1819. All right, now let me explain what it was caused by. In those days, a person would take out a loan, let's say the year now is 2019, say, I promise I'll pay this loan off when my money comes in 2025. But it will take 6 years for this business build up. When this business builds up, I'll pay it back. All right, now, folks, what happened then cannot happen today. If you take out a loan to buy a car, as long as you are making payments on that car that you promised, that car is yours. So you say, you assign the paperwork, I will pay $500 a month. As long as you're making those payments, that car is yours. Or if you buy a house and say, I'll pay $1,000 a month for 15 years. As long as you make the payments, they can't come and bother you about the house. But in those days, the banks could call in your loan if they needed to. So what happened in 1819, all of a sudden, some people started demanding their money. They called it a panic, means a run on the banks. The banks went to their customer, wrote to us, we require, due to circumstances beyond that, you pay off your loan because we need your money right now. Now that again, if you're shaking your head like whatever, that can't happen today. Well, it created what's called a panic. The banks had to have their money right now. Particularly a bank called the Second Bank of the United States had lent out money too freely. This was the one and only panic that was not blamed on the president at the time, President Roe. Anyway, the panic of 1819 was a big economic downturn. By the way, it affected both sides of the Atlantic. Both England has experienced it, and it was the beginning of times where when one nation went downhill economically, they all went down together. Started in 1819. The panic was fortunately short-lived, but it let people know that good economic times will not always last forever. Now we're going to talk about other panics later. Panic in 1837, 1857, 1877, 1897. This was to lead folk to the Great Depression of the 30s, where we had an economic downturn that lasted. All right. A lot of Americans lost their savings. A lot of Americans lost their property. Nearly every American was hurt. Well, more and more men got the right to vote. Not blacks, but more and more white men. The property owning, it was determined that, hey, what about these rich men who don't own any property, but they're wealthy because they have a good business? What about the blacksmith here who owns nothing but his blacksmith shop, but nevertheless he's pretty wealthy? Or what about the tanner who doesn't own anything other than his tanning shop, but he's wealthy? They finally decided that they let more and more people vote, including people who were not farmers and who were not property owners. So the franchise became more and more, bigger. The election of 1828. In the election of 1828, Jackson was ready for him, and so were buddies. This was the first election that featured a whole lot of picnics and a whole lot of what I have to call beer parties, for lack of a better term. These people would get together and drink heavily and sing songs for their favorite candidate. John Quincy Adams was pictured as being an aristocrat who was insensitive and didn't know or care about the common man. Andrew Jackson was pictured as a man of the common man, but Jackson had his problems, namely his wife and his dueling. Of course, I think I've already mentioned how that Jackson won the election, became president. On the day he was inaugurated, a bunch of Jackson supporters went into the White House and stomped all over this furniture, White House that Jefferson, not Jeff, but that Madison and Monroe had bought from England. Stomped with their muddy boots, and a lot of the old Federalists saw it as this democracy, if this is democracy, you don't want it. Again, Andrew Jackson entered the White House without his wife. His sister served as First Lady, as had been the case with Thomas Jefferson. Well, because his sister did not take an active part in Washington parties, the vice president's wife, Mrs. Calhoun, was actually the leader of Washington Female Society. Now, these women were highly influential. Even though they had no right to vote, nevertheless, they often discussed politics with their husband. And, all right. Now, Jackson suffered a lot from depression and mercury and lead poisoning. The bullet in his chest remained there till the day he died, and it caused him a whole lot of pain. But he would entertain guests, even unannounced ones. When he couldn't get his way with the people whom he had appointed to serve as a cabinet, he got another cabinet called the Kitchen Cabinet. What's the Kitchen Cabinet? These were personal friends who did not have an official position. And this was to lead to what we have today, but it is official today, where a president, yes, he appoints a Secretary of State, he appoints a Secretary of Defense, he appoints a Postmaster General, he appoints a Secretary of Education and Welfare, but he also has his personal friends who work right there in the White House with him. They're called the staff. And there's a chief of staff and other staff members and attorney staff and a press staff, a person who handles the press. The staff does not live in the White House, but they work there. So they'll come to work every day and go to the White House and work face to face with the president. Unlike the cabinet that has their own offices some distance away from the White House. The staff works right there inside. Now, we began at this time to educate girls in the schools. Now, this was not in the South. The difference between the South and North, the Southerners didn't have many schools, and a lot of Southerners were not educated. A famous baseball player of the 19-teens, Shootist Joe Jackson by name, had to sign his contract with an X and have somebody witness the X. He couldn't even write his own name. This was not unheard of amongst Southern people. But the Southerners did not see the value of education. The Northern people did. The cost of producing books and newspapers went down and down, and more people became able to read. Penny newspapers came on the scene. They're called penny because they cost a penny. And you might wonder, how could the people afford to put out newspapers for a penny? Well, simply the printing press. You get an article together, put it on type, and then just print them out by the hundreds and sell them for a penny a piece. And you made a little bit of money that way. Dime novels, put together a novel and put out hundreds of copies and sell them for a dime. Cheap. Keep in mind the wage back then was only about $1.25 a day, but a dime novel was still cheap. Dime novels came about. Women began to be hired as school teachers. It was believed that female teachers of the lower grades were better than men teachers. This is still largely believed. So in the first 4 and 5 grades, you have mostly female teachers. Then in the higher grades, it's more even between men and women. In Shakespeare's day, women did not act. When a part was like in a play Romeo and Juliet, Juliet was played by a young boy. A young boy that would dress as a girl, or a woman, a grown woman. But then women began to be actresses more and more. and appear on stage. At first this was frowned upon. I must say this about acting. A lot of Christians down through the ages have frowned on it. And I was asked one time why. One of the reasons, folk, is that all down through the ages, the personal lives of people who get on stage has often left a whole lot to be desired. And some of you might know a lot more about this than I do. But a lot of your entertainment people will wind up being drug dependent or commit suicide or both. Again, a lot of us, we could name names. You may or may not know the man who shot Abraham Lincoln was an actor. A famous actor at that, and his brother was a little bit more famous than he was. They oftentimes do not know, they get so involved in the fake world that they're trying to create that they can't differentiate between the world of reality and a fake world. And some of them, when they play the role of a bad person, they get so involved that they actually become a bad person themselves. Again, if any of you know more about this than I do, your comments are welcome. But acting became more and more respectable as time went on. All right, and this leads us to a topic I don't have time for, the Second Great Awakening. Like the other class folk, I did not finish with chapter 11, but that's okay. Next time I've only got 2 chapters on the list, chapters 12 and 13. But I'll start next Saturday's lecture with chapter 11. And the test will cover up to chapter 13. The test will be week after next. With that, you are dismissed.